Hello guys, welcome back to another video Today this video is going to be covering another series on the logic series or formal logic, and this is going to be a video on hypothetical syllogisms. And now remember, as I've said, I've taken all my information from Reverend Charles Coppin's book, A Brief Textbook into Mental Philosophy and Logic, and I've also used another source, and it's from Desire Joseph Messier, his book on Elements of Logic, which is a really good source, which I will cover later. I will cover multiple logic books since it's always good for us to get the perspective of multiple logicians, right? And let's get started. Okay, so before we get started into this video, there is some preliminary vocab that you must know. So the first off is the major premise. So a major premise is a proposition that implies the thesis. It's usually the first premise in every syllogism, although the order does not determine whether it's a major or minor, just to note, by the way. And the minor premise is a premise that confirms something, it's a second proposition that it does. So the major implies while the minor confirms. Now, let's get started. Well, first of all, what is a hypothetical syllogism? Now, in short, a hypothetical syllogism is not a categorical syllogism, obviously, but in the most blatant definition, a hypothetical syllogism is one whose major premise is a hypothetical proposition. And it isn't categorical, as I've said, right? Because a categorical proposition affirms something it affirms or denies something absolutely of a certain subject, right? And so there are three types of hypothetical propositions, and likewise there are three types of hypothetical syllogisms. And the three types include the conditional, the disjunctive, and lastly the conjunctive, right? So the conditional would be like if P then Q, the disjunctive would be A or B, and then the conjunctive or the conjunctive syllogism would start off with the major premise that it is not the case that A and B, right? So its major premise starts off with an incompatibility. Now, first of all, the conditional syllogism, it derives its power or force from an affirmed connection between a condition, or that is a antecedent, and a consequent. That is, if I say, for example, if P is true, then likewise the consequent then Q is also true, or Q is true. Where if a certain condition or antecedent is verified, the consequent is also verified. And in the major, there is only the assertion of a necessary connection between the condition and the conditioned, that is the antecedent and the consequent, in other words. And once the connection is accepted, the reasoning simply uses the first part as the minor premise and the second as the conclusion, though there is different ways, which we're going to see right now, and we'll see that in the application of modus ponens and modus tollens. So, first of all, if the consequent is false, then the condition must also be false, that is the antecedent. And the conditional hypothetical syllogism can conclude in two ways. The first way is affirmatively, and the second way negatively. Now, the first way, that is affirmatively, is when the condition, that is the antecedent, is true, and likewise the consequent must also be true, but not vice versa, because then we would be committing the fallacy, and you can also search it up in the logicallyfallacious.com. It's called affirming the consequent. So for example, this syllogism, this conditional syllogism right here is perfectly valid. That is, if the sun shines, it is day. If P then Q, we establish a necessity between the conditioned and the conditioned. And two, we state the condition, that is P, the sun shines in the minor, therefore we can rightly conclude and verify the consequent, that is, therefore it is day. But if we switch the minor premise, that is, and we say the minor premise was it is day, then the fact that the sun shines, or the conclusion that the sun shines will not follow, because it would be like this. If I said if the sun shines, it is day, that is if P then Q, and I assert Q, therefore P, that is invalid and fallacious, right? Because remember, in the major premise, it assumes a necessary connection between the condition and the conditioned, and we would be committing the fallacy if we were to be affirming the consequent, as I've already stated, is a fallacy. So that definitely does not work. And two, The second is negatively, right? And this is an application of modus tollens. This is when the consequent is denied, and likewise the condition can also be denied, or has to be denied, or it must also be false, but not vice versa. So, for example, if I say, if the sun does shine, it is day, if P then Q, and I assume in my minor the negation of the consequent, that is not Q, or it is not day, I can therefore conclude not P, or I can reason that the antecedent is false, and I can say therefore the sun does not shine. But if we were to replace the minor again, and it was the sun does not shine, or denying the antecedent, which is another fallacy by the way, then it would not follow that it is not day. For example, this is the invalid syllogism here. If the sun does shines, it is day, if P then Q. 2. The sun does not shine, that is not P. And 3. Therefore it is not day, therefore not Q. This is very fallacious, and this is called denying the antecedent, and you can see I've put it on the screen. And its logical form is if P then Q, not P, therefore not Q. That is wrong. It's supposed to be the other way around. Right? Modus tollens is if P then Q, not Q, that is denying the consequent, and therefore we can deny the antecedent or the condition, but we cannot deny the antecedent or the condition and then reason to that our consequent is false, so it is valid. Now, this conditional syllogism in particular, and every other conditional syllogism, can be reduced to a categorical syllogism. So, for example, if I were to reduce it, it would look like this, and this is what Coppens gives us. First, premise 1 is all times of sunshine are day, that is all A is B. 2, this is a time of sunshine, that is all C is A, therefore it is day. All C is B. Now remember, singular terms are taken in their full extension, which just means they're distributed, right? So for example, if I say Socrates is man, the concept of man belongs to all that Socrates is, right? That's why it's equivalent to all C is A, and it's also equivalent if I was going to say all persons identical to Socrates is man. Right, and that's why Socrates is a man is a universal affirmative, and this is actually a pretty basic mistake a lot of us make. It's totally fine. A lot of people make mistakes first time, but just to note that singular terms are taken in their full extension. So for example, if I say Luther was not a monk, the concept of monk belongs to none that Luther is, and that's why Luther is taken in his full extension right there, right? And the and so that's basically for the conditional syllogism, and I've clarified. Hopefully that made sense for why singular terms are distributed. So like Socrates is a man, where Socrates is distributed, but man is not. Right? In any affirmative proposition, the predicate will never be distributed. It will never be taken in its full extension. Either in the universal affirmative, that is every S is P, where only S is distributed, or some S is P, which is the particular affirmative, where no term is distributed. Right? Alright, moving on. The disjunctive syllogism, on the other hand, that is the either-or syllogism, has for its major a disjunctive proposition, which not merely alleges an incompatibility, but implies an alternative omitting no middle term. That is, if I had two options, there is no third option. There is no third possibility. So, for example, in this scenario, we have three options, right, which Coppens gives us, and this is our major premise. Either the father, or the mother, or the child is the natural head of the family. When using a disjunctive syllogism, we assume that the disjunction is complete, meaning no other possibilities, and in the case above, there is no fourth scenario, but only three. From that major above, we can reason in three ways. That is, the first way is, first, if the minor premise says one option is false, then the conclusion must be that the remaining options, if more than one, are still possible and affirms them, right? So, for example, but the child is not the natural head of the family, therefore either the father or the mother is such. So if you really wanted to structure it out again, it would be either the father or the mother or the child is the natural head of the family. But the child is not the natural head of the family, therefore we can exclude the child and affirm the rest of the possibilities or disjuncts in the conclusion. That is, therefore either the father or the mother is such, or that is the natural head of the family. The second way is also is kind of controversial, but I'm going to clarify that it's not fallacious. The second way is where the minor affirms one of the members, and the conclusion denies the others together. in the conclusion. And so it goes like this. Either the father, the mother, or the child is the natural head. Minor, but the father is the natural head. Conclusion, therefore neither the mother nor the child is the natural head. Now, it appears that this second way appears to be fallacious, and it commits a fallacy called affirming a disjunct. But I'm going to tell you why it's actually not fallacious. That is because in this scenario, or this particular disjunctive syllogism, it has something we call a strong exclusivity. That means between its disjuncts, if a disjunct is true, then it excludes the other. And it's thus not fallacious. And this fallacy only applies to those syllogisms whose or just implies inclusivity, or it just doesn't imply exclusivity. As for example, if I have this syllogism, either we go to the park or we go to the mall. Two, we are going to the park, that is, we're affirming a disjunct. Therefore, we are not going to the mall. This is fallacious. Why? Because notice in the major premise, the disjunct has no exclusivity. Its exclusivity, is weak. It's still possible that I could go to the park and go to the mall, right? So in this scenario, it is fallacious. But in this scenario, Coppens gives us it's not because of the strong exclusivity on the disjunct. So this fallacy really depends on the exclusivity of the disjunct, whether it excludes the other options, right? And the third way is where the minor may deny all the members but one, and the conclusion affirms that one. That is, for example, if either the father or the mother or the child is the natural head of the family, and in premise 2 states that the mother and the child is not the natural head of the family, and then the only option left is the father, and then I can affirm that one in the conclusion. And I would say, therefore, the father is the natural head of the family. Finally and lastly, we have the last hypothetical syllogism, that is the syllogism that argues from incompatibility, which is the conjunctive syllogism. And a conjunctive syllogism just simply has a major premise that's conjunctive. The conjunctive syllogism is a syllogism that alleges, or the major proposition of it alleges an incompatibility between two cases, one of which is affirmed in order to eliminate the other. That is the negation of A and B. That is, this is read as, it is not the case that A and B. And Coppens gives us the example of a syllogism. So this is an example of a conjunctive syllogism. First is, no one can love God and hate his neighbor. That is, it is not the case that A and B, but the martyrs loved God, where we affirm a incompatible predicate, that is A, and then therefore we can deny the other predicate in the conclusion. So here, to derive validity for a conjunctive syllogism, we affirm one of the incompatible predicates in the minor premise, and the minor premise is premise 2 here, by the way, and then denying the other in the conclusion. We can also do, for example, no one can love God and hate his neighbor. That is, it is not the case A and B, and then we can affirm B and then deny A. That is, Nero hated his neighbor, and therefore he did not love God. But we cannot absolutely do this. So while we can affirm a conjunct in the minor premise, we cannot deny a conjunct in the minor premise. That is, we cannot do this. So, for example, if it is not the case that A and B, then premise 2, and then we say that we suppose not A, and then we say Q is true. This is called denying a conjunct, which is a fallacy, by the way, and I put it on the screen, and its logical form goes like this. It is not the case both P and Q, not P, therefore Q. And as you can read, there's a description on the top, and yeah, that's basically it. And so just to recap on all of them, there's 3 types or species of hypothetical syllogisms. A hypothetical syllogism is not a categorical syllogism, because a categorical syllogism has a categorical major premise, and a categorical premise or a proposition is something that absolutely affirms or denies something of a subject, right? So first, we have a conditional. A conditional syllogism has a conditional major premise, that is, if P then Q. It's also written as P then Q with the arrow. Then we have a second, which is a disjunctive. It also alleges incompatibility with excluding possibilities. That is, it has a disjunctive major premise, that is A or B, right? And then 3, conjunctive syllogism, and it it just states an incompatibility between two choices. So it has a conjunctive major premise, that is, it is not the case that both A and B are true. And so to recap the valid inferences, let's start with the conditional. First, the two valid conditional inferences is if P then Q, P then Q, that is valid, that is an application known as modus ponens, or we can do P then Q, suppose negate the consequent, and then we can also negate the condition or the antecedent, and that is an application of modus tollens, which is also valid. Secondly, the valid inference for the disjunctive syllogism can go either A or B. Either A is true or B is true, and we can negate the we can negate one of the disjuncts in the minor premise and then affirm the other disjunct in the conclusion. So it also goes like A or B, not B, therefore A. But remember, we cannot do the other way around. We cannot affirm a disjunct unless there is specific cases when you substitute the letters for words that there is a strong exclusivity within the syllogism, as I've already clarified. But this is just the general perfect valid form for a disjunctive syllogism. And lastly, for the conjunctive syllogism, we can do it is not the case that both A and B is true. Suppose that A is true, therefore not B. Or we can do obviously we just switch the letters again, but remember, we can never deny a conjunct in the minor premise. That would be fallacious. And that's basically it for hypothetical syllogisms. I hope that clarified everything. If you have any questions, let me know. And that's basically it for this video.